There's a specific kind of darkness that lives in old-growth forests. A darkness that feels heavier than just the absence of light. I know this because I once spent a night in a place that shouldn't exist, on a path that refused to let me go. It wasn't about getting lost. It was about being taken. The real horror began when I realized the trail I was on was no longer made of dirt and stone, but of something else entirely, something that was aware of me. My mistake was overconfidence. I'd hiked the trails of Pine Ridge for over a decade, and the 5-mile Lookout Point loop was practically my backyard. I started late in the afternoon, chasing the golden hour for some photography, telling myself I knew every twist and route like the back of my hand. The air was crisp, with the promise of autumn, and the woods felt welcoming, familiar. I reached the summit, took my pictures of the valley bathed in orange and purple, and turned back with plenty of what I thought was daylight left. The descent was always faster, but as the sun dipped below the ridge, the forest began to change. The familiar, friendly shadows of the pines grew long and distorted, clutching at the edges of the path. A chill set in that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was a subtle shift, like a single note in a symphony turning sour, a wrongness that prickled the hairs on my arms. The first clear sign was a trail marker, a simple blue blaze painted on an old oak. I'd passed it 100 times, except this time, as my headlamp beam caught it, the paint looked fresh, almost wet, and just beyond it, the path forked. It had never forked there before. I checked. My phone no signal, which was normal, and pulled out my compass. The needle quivered, spinning lazily before settling on a direction that felt completely wrong. I chose the left fork, the one that seemed to slope more steeply downhill, figuring it was the most direct route. The forest grew unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. 10 minutes later, I saw it again. The same oak tree, the same wet-looking blue blaze, the same impossible fork in the path. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled in my stomach. I hadn't circled back. I had been returned. I stopped, forcing myself to think logically. I was tired. It was dark. I was disoriented. I turned around, determined to retrace my steps, back to the summit. But the path behind me was gone. Not overgrown or hard to see, it was simply gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of thorny, tangled brush that hadn't been there moments before. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I was trapped. I pushed forward again, taking the right fork this time. The path seemed to narrow, the trees closing in, their branches weaving together overhead until the sky was completely blotted out. The beam of my headlamp felt small, swallowed by an oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I started calling out, my voice sounding thin and pathetic. The only answer was a bizarre, faint echo that sounded less like my own voice and more like a mocking imitation of it. Then came the whispers. They were at the edge of my hearing, indistinct and layered, like dozens of people murmuring just out of sight. I'd stop, strain to listen, and they'd vanish, replaced by that suffocating silence. I kept walking for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my throat raw. The path never changed. It was an endless, winding corridor of black trees and whispering shadows. My headlamp started to flicker, the beam turning a sickly yellow. I knew. The batteries were fresh. It was the forest, the place itself, that was draining the life from everything within it. The climax of that night wasn't a creature leaping from the shadows. It was a moment of dreadful understanding. The path opened unexpectedly into a small, perfect clearing. In the center stood a single, massive boulder, one I'd never seen before. It was covered in carvings, but they weren't any symbols I recognized. They were deep, gouged-out spirals, all leading to the center of the stone. As my fading headlamp beam traced their twisted shapes, the whispering returned, louder now, coming from all around me, as if the trees themselves were speaking. It was a language of rustling leaves and snapping twigs, and yet I understood the intent. It was a hunger. The path had led me here. It was a lure, a digestive tract, and this clearing was the stomach. I saw a flicker of movement near the edge of the woods, a shape, tall and impossibly thin, that was darker than the darkness around it. It didn't have a face, but I felt it watching me, studying me. The air grew thick, vibrating with a low hum that resonated deep in my chest. This was it. I was a meal. In a final, desperate act, I turned away from the path, away from the watching shape, and plunged directly into the tangled, thorny brush that bordered the clearing. I don't remember much after that. I remember thorns tearing at my clothes and skin, the feeling of falling, and then a profound, peaceful blackness. I woke to the blare of a truck's horn and the harsh glare of headlights. I was lying in a ditch on the side of the main highway, a good 10 miles from the Pine Ridge trailhead. My gear was shredded. I was covered in scratches, but I was alive. The truck driver who found me said I'd just appeared out of the woods. The police were called. A search party was organized, but they found nothing. No strange clearings, no carved boulders, no path that went nowhere. It doesn't exist on any map. I haven't been back to those woods since. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I can almost hear it. That faint, whispering sound, calling me back to the trail that waits for me in the dark. Hope can be a dangerous thing. It can be a pinprick of light in an ocean of black, a beacon that promises safety and warmth. But when you walk towards that light for hours, through an endless night, and it never gets any closer, hope curdles into a very specific kind of poison. You realize the light isn't a promise. It's the bait in a trap that has no walls and no ceiling. A trap made of nothing but distance and darkness. The road I was on wasn't on the map. It was a shortcut my GPS offered to shave an hour off a cross-country drive that had already taken 2 days. For the first 20 minutes, it was fine as simple. Straight ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through endless flat fields. Then, my car died. No sputtering, no warning light, just a sudden and complete silence as the engine cut out and I rolled to a stop. My phone, of course, had no service. I was surrounded by a darkness so total that it felt like a physical substance. The sky, a starless, obsidian lid, pressed down on the world. In the far distance, I saw it. One single, yellow light. A farmhouse, I thought. A lifeline. I grabbed my water bottle and a jacket, locked the car, and started walking. The air was still, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my own footsteps on the gravel shoulder. The light seemed maybe a mile or two away, an easy walk. That was my first miscalculation. An hour of walking past, my pace steady and determined, and the light remained exactly where it was, distant, unwavering speck. It didn't grow, it didn't shrink, it didn't flicker. It was a fixed point in a world that had seemingly begun to stretch around me. I stopped and looked back. The road was perfectly straight, yet my car was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind me as if it had never existed. A knot of unease tightened in my gut. I was standing on an infinite road between a past that had vanished and a future I could not reach. On either side of me, the field stretched into blackness, filled with a tall, swaying crop I couldn't identify. I kept walking, telling myself it was a trick of the flatland, an optical illusion. Then the other sound started. It was a faint, rhythmic scraping noise, coming from somewhere out in the field to my right. She-thump like something heavy, something with immense friction, was being dragged through the dry soil. It kept pace with me, never getting closer or farther away. I'd stop, and it would stop. I'd start walking again, and the sound would resume its dreadful, patient rhythm. My mind started to fray. Was I even moving? Or was the landscape scrolling past me like a theatrical backdrop? I shouted, and the sound was swallowed instantly by the oppressive emptiness. No echo, no reply. Only the incessant, maddening she-thump from the darkness to my right. The light ahead seemed to mock me. It wasn't a farmhouse. It was too steady, too perfect. Panic began to set in. The road felt like a trap, and whatever was in that field was its warden. I had to get off this path. In a moment of what I can only call desperate insanity, I veered off the asphalt and plunged into the dense rows of crops, hoping to cut across the field and escape the sound. The moment my feet left the road, everything changed. The ground was soft and spongy, unnaturally so. The scraping sound stopped. In its place, a new sound began, a soft, wet clicking, and it was coming from multiple directions, just ahead of me. The stalks of the plants weren't dry like corn. They were slick and vaguely pliant, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. I pushed through the last row of stalks and stumbled into a small, circular clearing. The moon, which had been absent all night, now cast a pale, sickly illumination from directly overhead. In the center of the clearing, I saw the source of the noise. A deep furrow, a trench, was being carved in the soil before my very eyes, extending itself without a plow or a person guiding it. And then I saw them. Standing over the furrow were three figures. They were impossibly tall and thin, their limbs like bent reeds. They had no faces, just smooth, pale surfaces where a face should be. They were the source of the clicking noise, their long, spindly fingers probing the fresh earth, planting small, pulsating, organic-looking objects into the trench. They were farmers. They were tending this alien landscape. As I stood there, frozen in utter terror, one of them straightened up, its whole body moving with a fluid grace that was deeply, horribly wrong. It turned its blank head towards me. It saw me, and I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that I was a weed in their garden. I don't remember screaming. I just remember the feeling of pure, animal terror as I turned and ran, crashing back through the fleshy, slick stalks, not caring about the direction. I burst out of the field, and my feet hit hard asphalt. I fell, scraping my hands and knees. When I looked up, I was there, right next to the driver's side door of my car. The engine was running. I didn't question it. I scrambled inside, slammed the door, and stomped on the gas. The car shot forward. I risked one glance in my rearview mirror. The field was just a field. The road was just a road. But high in the sky, exactly where the farmhouse light had been, was a single, unblinking yellow star that didn't belong to any constellation I knew. There are worse things than being lost in the wilderness. You can get lost in a place built by human hands, a place that's supposed to be a home. You can find yourself in a labyrinth of pristine asphalt and manicured lawns where every path leads back to where you started. You drive down the same street a dozen times, but you only realize it's the same street when you see your own tire tracks still fresh in the dew. That's when the real panic sets in. You're not just lost in a neighborhood, you're trapped in the blueprint. I was driving for a food delivery app to make ends meet, and the late-night shifts were always the most lucrative. The order that came in around 2 a.m. was a big one, with a tip to match, but the destination was a brand new development on the edge of town I'd never heard of, Somerset Meadows. My phone's GPS led me off the main highway and onto a series of newly paved roads that cut through what used to be farmland. As I passed under a large, ornate sign welcoming me to the neighborhood, my GPS signal died. The map on my phone froze. showing my car as a blue dot in a blank, unlabeled gray space. I figured I'd just follow the street signs. The address was 1422 Serenity Drive. The problem was, every single street I turned onto was named Serenity Drive. At first I thought it was a developer's quirk, a mistake. But after the fourth identical street sign, a cold unease began to creep over me. The neighborhood was a ghost town. Every house was a perfect two-story colonial, painted in the exact same shade of muted beige. Each lawn was a flawless green square, each driveway empty. The only light came from the sterile, orange glow of the streetlights, spaced at mathematically perfect intervals. I found house number 1422, parked, and walked to the door. The windows were dark, and the doorbell echoed in a way that told me the house was completely empty. No one was home. Frustrated, I got back in my car to leave, but the labyrinth had closed around me. Every turn, every cul-de-sac, fed me back onto another Serenity Drive, past another row of identical, vacant houses. My low-fuel light had been on for a while, and now the needle was kissing empty. Panic began to bubble in my chest. I was driving in circles, burning the last of my gas, in a perfectly rendered, completely soulless prison. That's when I started noticing the lights. Here and there, a single upstairs window would be lit, a faint, yellow square in the black facade of an otherwise dead house. It gave me a flicker of hope. As I drove past one, I glanced up and saw a shadow move past the window, a tall, slender silhouette. A moment of relief washed over me. People did live here. Then I passed another lit window on another street, and I saw it again. The same silhouette, moving in the exact same way, and again, and again. It was in every lit window, a silent, repeating sentinel in a neighborhood that was fundamentally wrong. My car engine sputtered and died directly under the buzz of a streetlight, plunging me into a terrifying silence. I was out of gas, stranded. My phone was a useless brick. Staying in the car felt like waiting in my own tomb. My only choice was to approach one of the houses with a light on. I picked one across the street, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lawn felt strangely stiff under my feet, like astroturf. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of fresh paint and something else. Something sterile, like a hospital. As I reached the concrete walkway, I looked up at the lit window, my hand half raised to knock, and what I saw broke my mind. The window wasn't a window into a room, it was a screen. It was displaying a live feed of the street behind me, shot from a high angle. The image was grainy, and the color was washed out. I could see my car parked under the streetlight. I could see myself, a small, pathetic figure, standing on the lawn, staring up. As I watched this impossible image of myself, a sound cut through. The silence from the house next door, a house I had presumed was as dark and empty as the rest. It was the distinct, metallic clack of a deadbolt being thrown. I turned my head, and the front door of that dark house began to swing inward, opening onto a void of pure, featureless black. It wasn't a hallway, it was an absence, an invitation to step out of this fake world and into whatever lay beyond it. I didn't accept. I ran. I abandoned the neat, paved roads and cut across the perfect, plastic lawns. I vaulted the identical white fences, my breath sobbing in my chest. The neighborhood seemed to stretch on forever, a repeating pattern of beige and green under that sickly orange sky. I just kept my eyes forward and ran until the houses suddenly stopped. There was no transition, no buffer zone. One moment I was on a lawn, the next my feet hit soft earth, and I was crashing through a line of unseen trees. I tumbled through the undergrowth and fell onto the gravel shoulder of a highway. The roar of a passing semi-truck, shocking me back to reality. I looked back. There was no Somerset Meadows, no ornate sign, no rows of beige houses. There was just an empty, moonlit field. According to my phone, which now had full service and a full battery, It was 2:15 a.m. I had been gone for less than 30 minutes. You learn to read people when you deliver their food. You see the brief, unguarded slice of their life when they open the door. The exhausted parent, the lonely student, the couple having a movie night. But every now and then, you get an order that doesn't fit. A request so strange it makes the hair on your arms stand up before you even arrive. I got one of those orders on a rainy Tuesday night. The final instruction read, "Leave the bags on the porch. Do not knock. Do not ring the bell. We will know you are here. Payment for your trouble is under the welcome mat." It was my last delivery of the night. The pay was unusually high, enough to cover my gas for the week and then some, so I ignored the initial red flag. The address was in a part of the city I rarely went to, a neighborhood of old, grand houses that had seen better days. Their paint peeling under the dim glow of antiques. The house itself was a hulking Victorian, dark and silent, except for a single, weak yellow light filtering through a colored pane of glass in the front door. The rain was coming down harder now, plastering my hair to my forehead as I grabbed the two large, heavy bags from my passenger seat. The order was bizarre in large containers of nothing but steamed white rice. No sauce, no protein, nothing, just rice. The sheer volume felt ceremonial, not like a meal. As I walked up the slick, mossy steps to the porch, I felt a powerful sense of being watched, not just from the house in front of me, but from all of them. The whole street felt like it was holding its breath. I placed the bags down gently in front of the door, the faint yellow light from within casting a sickly pallor on the white paper. The delivery instructions replayed in my mind. "We will know. You are here." A floorboard creaked inside, followed by a soft, dry, shuffling sound. It wasn't one person. It sounded like a dozen people moving slowly in unison, just beyond the door. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the worn-out welcome mat. It was thin and frayed, with the word welcome barely legible. I knelt, the dampness of the porch seeping into the knee of my jeans, and lifted a corner. There was no cash, just a single, ornate, old-fashioned brass key. As my fingers touched its cold surface, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message from the customer. "The tip is inside. First door on your left. Please come in. Don't be shy." The shuffling inside stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave. The food, forget the money, and just go. But the lure of the payment and a terrifying, magnetic curiosity held me in place. This felt less like a delivery and more like a test. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a deep, grinding thud that echoed in the quiet street. I pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit foyer. The air that washed over me was thick with the smell of dust, dried flowers, and something else, something vaguely metallic and sweet. My eyes immediately dropped to the floor, as if commanded by some unseen force. I didn't want to see what was in the shadows of that vast room. Out of the corner of my eye, I could perceive shapes, tall motionless figures standing along the far wall, their presence a palpable weight in the gloom. I didn't dare look up. I focused on the floor, on the worn parquet tiles, and saw the first door on the left, just as the message had said. It was slightly ajar. From within, I could hear a faint, rhythmic humming, a low, sorrowful tune. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bare, devoid of any furniture, except for a small, rickety wooden table in the center. On it was a stack of cash far, more than the original tip hand, a single porcelain bowl filled with steaming white rice. A single chopstick stood upright in its center. My phone buzzed one last time. The message was short. A guest's portion. I didn't touch the bowl. The humming had stopped. The house was utterly silent. I knew with chilling certainty that the figures in the foyer were now turned towards me, waiting to see what I would do. This was the final step of the test. An offering, an invitation to join them. I snatched the cash from the table, my fingers fumbling with the notes. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned and fled, not daring to look back at the still, silent shapes in the hall. I didn't stop to close or lock the door. I vaulted down the porch steps, scrambled into my car, and drove. I didn't look in my rearview mirror until I was back on the brightly lit main road. The order was marked as complete, the payment cleared. I quit that job the next day. Sometimes, when I'm about to eat, I see it in my mind, that bowl of rice, the single chopstick standing like a tiny gravestone, and I lose my appetite completely. As a delivery driver, an open door is a welcome sign. It usually means a quick drop-off, a friendly wave, and an easy trip. But that night, the door was only open a crack, spilling a sliver of warm light onto the dark porch. And when I called out, the voice that answered from deep within the house was too friendly, too eager. "Come on in," it boomed. "The game's on, and I can't miss it." Kitchen's down the hall. An invitation like that isn't normal. It's a breach of the unspoken contract between customer and driver. It's the first step into a trap. I was delivering 2 large pepperoni pizzas to a house in a newer suburban development called Oak Hollow. It was a Tuesday night, just past 9, and the streets were quiet. All the houses were cookie-cutter 2-story homes, bathed in the gentle glow of porch lights. It felt safe, mundane. The only thing out of place was the faint, tinny sound of an ice cream truck jingle echoing through the neighborhood, a cheerful melody that felt strangely out of place in the dark. I walked up to the house, pizza warmer in hand, and saw the front door was already ajar. After the man's voice called me in, I hesitated. Company policy was clear: never enter a customer's home. But I was a college kid, tired and behind on rent, and the thought of a good tip pushed me forward. I nudged the door open and stepped inside. The living room was neat, immaculate even. A hallway stretched out before me. "To your left," the voice called again, still distant. The hallway was longer than I expected. The walls were covered in framed family photos, dozens of them. But as I walked, I noticed something deeply unsettling. In every picture, a wedding, a birthday party, a beach vacation, the faces were all smudged, indistinct blurs of color, as if they had been deliberately rubbed away. The cheerful ice cream music seemed louder in here, but still maddeningly distant. A cold feeling washed over me. I glanced back at the front door, and my blood ran cold. It was at least 50 feet away, a tiny rectangle of light at the end of a hallway that had somehow elongated the moment I turned my back. I was in a place where geometry was a suggestion, not a rule. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, pulled forward by the cheerful voice and the promise of a transaction. I finally reached the kitchen, a bright, sterile room. The man was nowhere to be seen. I placed the pizzas on the granite island, and the voice called out again, this time from directly above me. "Thanks a million. Tips on the counter. Just leave the receipt, and I'll sign it." The voice was just as friendly, just as booming. It belonged to a man who had no idea his house was a nightmare. On the counter sat a crisp $20 bill. I should have taken it and left, but I was disoriented, and the idea of getting a signature, of completing the task as normal, felt like an anchor to reality. "I'm up here," he called. I walked back into the impossible hallway and took the stairs. Each step felt like a descent into some deeper wrongness. The ice cream jingle was clearer now, but warped and sour. like a dying music box. The top of the stairs opened onto another long hallway, an exact copy of the one below, lined with more photos of faceless people. All the doors were closed except for one at the very end. As I walked towards it, a morbid curiosity made me try the handle of a closed door. It opened into a bedroom, but it was an exact replica of the living room downstairs. I opened another. It was the kitchen again, identical in every detail. The house wasn't a home. It was a collection of copied rooms, pasted together in a way that didn't make sense. I reached the open door at the end of the hall. The warped music was coming from inside. I peered around the frame and saw him. He was a large man, standing, with his back to me, looking out the window into the dark. "Perfect timing," he said, his voice now calm and close. "They're just getting to our street." I looked past him, out the window, expecting to see streetlights and the flashing beacon of an ice cream truck. But there was nothing, just a silent, starless, black void. An absolute emptiness where the neighborhood should have been. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the room and saw the source of the sound. On a small table sat a child's music box, its tiny metal cylinder spinning, plinking out that horrible, cheerful tune. "My favorite," the man said softly, still, facing the void. "It always reminds me of when I was a boy." He hadn't seen me. He was talking to himself. He was waiting for an ice cream truck that existed only in his memory. In a house that existed outside of reality. I didn't make a sound. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned and ran, the faceless families watching me from the walls. The house seemed to shrink around me as I fled, the hallway returning to a normal length. I burst through the front door into the humid night air, and didn't stop until I was in my car, fumbling with the keys. As I sped away, I glanced back at the house. He was in the window now, a hulking silhouette against the yellow light, perfectly still, watching me leave. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the faint sound of the ice cream truck jingle vanished completely. In the delivery business, you're paid to be incurious. You're a link in a chain, a ghost that ferries a package from one world to another. You take the bag, you drive, you drop it off. You're not supposed to wonder what's in it. But one night, I was handed a package that made curiosity feel like a survival instinct. It wasn't in a paper bag or a pizza box. It was in a small, heavy, medical-grade cooler, the kind you see in movies just before the mad scientist monologue. And it was humming. I worked for a premium courier service that contracted with a few high-end food apps. My job was to be fast, discreet, and reliable. This order was flagged as priority gastronomy, with a payout that was more than my weekly salary. The pickup wasn't a restaurant, but a sterile, unmarked ghost kitchen in an industrial park. A man in a sweat-stained chef's coat and a surgical mask met me at the door. He didn't say hello. He just thrust the humming cooler into my hands. It was surprisingly heavy and cold, like a block of dry ice. "ASAP," he hissed, his eyes wide with a fear that went far beyond a bad dinner rush. "It's for Mr. Sterling. The temperature is critical. Do not, under any circumstances, open the container." I nodded, secured the box in my passenger seat, and peeled out of the parking lot, the chef watching me until I turned the corner. The delivery was to a penthouse apartment downtown. The GPS said 30 minutes. As I drove, I couldn't ignore the box. The low, electrical hum it emitted seemed to vibrate right through the seat, a constant, low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. Then, as I hit unexpected gridlock on the freeway, the nature of the box began to change. The surface, once cold, was now growing warm against the upholstery, and the humming was shifting, resolving itself into a slow, rhythmic pulse. thump dash thump, dot dot dot, thump thump. It was the most deliberate, organic sound I had ever heard from an inanimate object. My phone buzzed. A message from the customer, Mr. Sterling. Status! I typed back. Stuck in traffic ATA Bentamings. The pulsing in the box seemed to quicken in response, growing more insistent. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me, a feeling of claustrophobic panic that wasn't my own. It felt like it was radiating from the box. My phone buzzed again. Unacceptable. Get here. The box was hot now. The thump was faster, a frantic, desperate rhythm that resonated deep in my own chest. It felt like I was in a car with a dying animal, or something far, far worse. By the time I pulled up to the glittering glass tower of the apartment building, the cooler was vibrating violently. The pulsing was so strong I could feel it through the steering wheel. I grabbed the box. It felt alive in my hands, and ran into the lobby. A stern-looking doorman gave me a nod and pointed me to a private elevator. The ride up to the penthouse was the longest 60 seconds of my life. The box shuddered and pulsed, and I felt dizzy, my ears popping from a strange internal pressure. The elevator doors opened directly into a massive, opulent apartment. A woman stood waiting. She was perfectly dressed, but her face was a mask of sheer terror, her hair disheveled. She didn't speak. She just stared at the cooler with a raw, desperate need. I placed it on the marble floor between us. The moment it was down, she fell upon it, her hands fumbling with the heavy-duty latches. There was a loud hiss as the seal broke, and then silence. The pulsing stopped. The pressure in my head vanished. The relief was so sudden and total that I almost collapsed. The woman threw open the lid. I couldn't see the contents clearly from my angle, but I saw her reach inside. She lifted something out. It was a large, glistening piece of what looked like raw, dark meat, perhaps a steak or a liver. But it was covered in a web of what looked like veins, thin blue lines that pulsed with a faint, residual light. As I watched, horrified, the light in the veins faded, and they turned a dead, sullen black. The woman cradled the strange meat to her chest, looking at it not as food, but as a rescued loved one. She began to sob, deep, racking sobs of pure relief, whispering, "Oh, thank God, thank God, dot dot dot." She looked up at me, her eyes wild. She shoved a thick envelope of cash into my hand, far more than the promised payment, and pushed me back towards the elevator. "Thank you," she choked out. "You don't know what you've done. You saved us." The elevator doors closed on her hunched, sobbing form. I never reported it. Who would I report it to? And what would I even say? I quit that job. I couldn't shake the feeling of that living, pulsing box, or the image of that fading blue light. I can't bring myself to eat meat anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I'll feel a phantom pulse in my chest. When you deliver pizzas for a living, you see a cross-section of humanity. You go to frat houses, quiet suburban homes, and sketchy apartment buildings, all in the same shift. 99% of the time, it's boringly normal, but that other 1%, that's where the stories are. That's when you get a call that takes you to an address that feels wrong, a house that's too new, too quiet, and a customer who seems less like a person and more like a performance. I had one of those deliveries, and it made me realize that some people aren't just ordering dinner. They're ordering an audience. I was working for a local place called Gino's, slinging pies to pay for my community college textbooks. It was a miserable, rainy October Tuesday, the kind of night where the whole world feels gray and damp. We were about to close up when one last order came through the online portal. A large pepperoni and a 2-liter of soda. Cash payment. The Address was for a new subdivision on the far west edge of town called Creekwood Estates. I'd seen the billboards, but I'd never actually been out there. It was a massive new development, still mostly under construction. A place of future homes that were currently just skeletons of timber and plastic wrap. The manager almost canceled the order because of the distance and the weather, but the tip was preset at $20. For that kind of money, I'd have delivered to the moon. I grabbed the pizza bag, plugged the address into my phone, and headed out into the rain. The farther I drove, the newer and sparser the houses became, until I finally turned onto the road for the estate. It was barely a road at all, just graded dirt and gravel that had turned to a soupy mud in the rain. My little sedan struggled through it. All the houses were in various states of construction, dark and silent husks. It was a ghost town in the making. My GPS told me I had arrived, but the house it indicated was the only one on the entire street that looked completely finished. It was a 2-story beige house with a perfect lawn that had no business being so green and manicured in the middle of a construction site. Every light in the house was on, making it blaze against the oppressive darkness of the rainy night. It looked less like a home and more like an advertisement for one. There were no cars in the driveway, no toys on the lawn, no sign of life at all besides the light. I felt a weird prickle of unease as I pulled up. I grabbed the pizza bag and walked to the front door. The air was unnaturally still. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the roof. The doorbell was a plastic placeholder with no button, so I knocked. After a moment, the door was opened by a man who looked to be in his early 40s. He was wearing a perfectly pressed gray suit, completely out of place for a Tuesday night at home. His smile was wide, bright, and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes were a pale, flat blue, and they didn't seem to blink. "Right on time," he said, his voice smooth and even, like a synthesized voice from a GPS. He handed me two brand new, impossibly crisped $20 bills. "Keep the change." I handed him the pizza and the soda, and the transaction was over. But as I turned to leave, he cleared his throat. "One more thing, if you don't mind." I stopped. "Could you tell me how it looks from out there?" I was confused. "The pizza?" I asked. His smile never wavered. "No, the house, the experience, the warm glow, the friendly homeowner, the comforting aroma of a hot meal. Is the tableau convincing?" Tableau. It was such a strange, clinical word. I didn't know what to say. I glanced past him, into the house. The entryway was completely, totally empty. No photos on the walls, no rug on the floor, no furniture in sight. Just empty, beige, sterile space. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Yeah, I stammered. "It looks nice. Looks like a home." The man's smile seemed to widen, if that was even possible. "Excellent. We value external feedback." He then closed the door with a soft, final click. I practically ran back to my car, my mind racing. The whole thing felt scripted, rehearsed, fundamentally wrong. I fumbled with my keys, started the engine, and threw the car in reverse. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked at the big picture window next to the front door. The man was standing there, in the middle of the empty living room. He wasn't holding the pizza. He was just standing perfectly still, his hands at his sides, that same vacant smile plastered on his face, watching me. Then, just as I pulled away, every single light in the house went out simultaneously, plunging it into the same absolute darkness as all the other houses on the street. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest. I spun the car around and sped down the muddy track, away from that place. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The house was dark, but then a light flickered on in the house next to it, and then the next one, and the one after that. In a horrifying, silent cascade, lights were turning on in every single unfinished, skeletal house down the entire street, each one revealing nothing but empty frames and hollow window sockets. It wasn't one. Man, it was a whole street of them. Just as I fishtailed back onto the paved road, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text message from an unknown number. It had just 4 words. "Thank you for participating." I drove straight back to the shop, told my manager the customer was a no-show, and I'd lost the pizza in the mud. I paid for it out of my own pocket. I couldn't bring myself to explain what had really happened. Who would believe me? I quit the next day. I never went back to that part of town, but I still think about it. I think about that perfect, empty house and that man with the plastic smile. I wasn't delivering a pizza. I was delivering a prop. I was an unwitting actor who had stumbled onto a stage where something was practicing, learning how to be us. Every pizza delivery driver has their regulars. You get to know them by their orders, not their names. There's the Friday night family with the 2 pepperoni pizzas, the college kid with the late night meat lovers, and the quiet old lady who orders the same thing at the same time every single week. For me, that was Mrs. Gable. For 6 months, her standing order was a small beacon of predictability in a chaotic job. But over time, I came to dread that delivery, and I realized I wasn't just bringing her dinner. I was an unwitting participant in a quiet, weekly ritual held inside a house that was rotting from the inside out. I worked at one of those big chain pizzerias in a town small enough that our delivery area bled into the surrounding countryside. That's where Mrs. Gable lived. Her order would come in every Friday at 6:15 p.m. on the dot. 1 large cheese pizza, extra sauce, well done. Her house was at the very end of our delivery zone, a 15-minute drive that ended on a long, unpaved road. It was an old, 2-story farmhouse, gray and weathered, with a sagging porch and windows so grimy they looked like they were painted black. The place had a heavy, silent atmosphere, the kind that makes you want to leave your engine running. For the first few months, the routine was always the same. I'd pull up. She'd already be waiting behind the screen door, a stooped silhouette in the gloom. She'd pay with the exact amount in cash, including a $1 tip, her hand trembling slightly as she passed the money through the gap. She never spoke a word beyond a mumbled thank you. I never saw inside the house. The main door was always shut behind the screen, keeping the interior shrouded in darkness. It was creepy, sure, but it was reliable. The change was subtle at first. One Friday in early spring, she took longer to come to the door. When she finally opened it, I caught a glimpse inside. The house was as dark as I'd imagined, but I could make out several figures in what looked like a living room. There were 3 or 4 of them, sitting perfectly still on a couch and some armchairs, all facing a blank, dark television screen. Their posture was rigid, unnatural. "Family night," Mrs. Gable rasped, her voice dry as dead leaves, before quickly stepping in front of the gap to block my view. A few weeks later, I heard something new, a faint, tinny melody, like a child's music box, playing a simple, repetitive tune from somewhere deep within the house. The melody was slightly off-key, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. Mrs. Gable seemed more agitated that day, her eyes darting nervously back into the darkness behind her as she paid. The creepiest delivery, the one before the last one, happened on a hot summer evening. I arrived and found the main door was slightly ajar. I knocked on the screen door frame and called her name, but got no answer. After a moment of hesitation, I nudged the screen door open. "Mrs. Gable," I called out, my voice sounding small and thin. The smell that rolled out of the house was overwhelming. It was a cloying mix of dust, potpourri, and something else. Something sickly sweet and chemical, like formaldehyde. I took a half step inside, and my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The figures were there, sitting in their usual spots, but now I could see them clearly. They weren't people. They were mannequins. Life-sized, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their painted faces frozen in serene, uncanny smiles, and standing. Among them was Mrs. Gable, not looking at me, but gently, lovingly stroking the synthetic hair of a mannequin shaped like a little girl. My blood ran cold. I started backing out, my heel catching on the threshold. The small noise made her look up, and her eyes, wide with panic, locked with mine. "Oh," she breathed, her face collapsing into a mask of pure terror. You weren't meant to see them." She took a step forward, her hands fluttering at her sides. "They're shy," she whispered, as if that explained everything. My own hand was on the screen door, ready to bolt. One had to get out of there. But she spoke again, her voice dropping to a desperate, conspiratorial whisper. "But it's Friday. They know it's Friday. They get so hungry when they know the pizza is here." As she said the word hungry, the tinny music box melody started up. Again, its off-key notes drilling into my skull. Mrs. Gable's eyes darted away from me and towards the mannequin of the little girl. A look of profound fear crossed her face. "You have to bring it in," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She gestured with a palsied hand to the warm pizza box in my grasp. "Please, just set it on the table. If they don't get their dinner, they become so terribly restless." The way she said restless sent a shockwave of pure, primal fear through me. I imagined those plastic limbs beginning to twitch, those painted smiles beginning to crack. I didn't say a word. I did the only thing I could. I dropped the pizza and the cash bag on the rotting wood of the porch, turned, and ran. I didn't stop until I was locked in my car, speeding down that dirt road with a cloud of dust behind me. I never looked back. I quit that night. I heard through the grapevine a few months later that the county had condemned the property. The official story was that the old woman who lived there had passed away years ago, and the house had been sitting abandoned ever since. But I know what I saw. I know I delivered a pizza to that house every Friday for 6 months. I don't know who or what Mrs. Gable was, and I certainly don't know what her family was. But some nights, when it's too quiet, I can still hear that tinny, off-key music. And I thank God I never found out what restless really meant. In the pizza delivery business, you learn to live by the special instructions. Don't ring the doorbell. Baby is sleeping. Extra garlic sauce, please. They're small, mundane requests. But once, I got a set of instructions that weren't mundane at all. They weren't a request. They felt like a desperate plea, or maybe a warning. 4 simple sentences, typed in all caps, that I should have followed to the letter. But I didn't. And because I hesitated, I heard what lived on the other side of the door. I was working a busy Saturday night shift, the kind where orders blur into one long, greasy marathon. Around 11 p.m., a prepaid online order came in for the Chamberlain Arms, a grim, brutalist high-rise apartment building on the edge of downtown that had a reputation for being one step away from condemnation. The order was simple: 1 cheese pizza, no toppings. It was the instructions that made me pause. Floor 9, apartment 9B. Leave pizza on mat. Do not knock. Do not call. Leave the hallway immediately. I showed it to my manager, who just shrugged. Probably an agoraphobe or something. Just do what it says. It's already paid for. So I took the delivery. The Chamberlain was even worse up close. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp concrete. The elevator creaked and groaned, its way to the 9th floor, its light flickering ominously. The hallway of the 9th floor was a long, narrow corridor with sickly yellow walls and a low ceiling that made the space feel claustrophobic. It was eerily silent. I found apartment 9B at the far end. The door was made of heavy steel, unlike the wooden doors of the other apartments, and it was reinforced with 2 extra deadbolts and a thick slide lock. The welcome mat on the floor was stained with something dark. Remembering the instructions, I quietly placed the pizza box on the mat. My job was done. I should have turned around and walked away. But as I stood up, I heard a sound from within the apartment that froze me in my tracks. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, a wet, dragging sound, shuffle scrape. It was the sound of something heavy and limp being pulled across a bare floor. It was accompanied by a low, constant, guttural humming, like a faulty electrical transformer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to obey the instructions and leave, but a morbid curiosity rooted me to the spot. I backed away slowly, just a few feet down the hall, partially hiding myself around a corner where I could still see the door. The shuffling, scraping sound grew louder as it approached the other side of the steel door. The humming intensified, vibrating through the floor, a low, menacing thrum that I could feel in my teeth. Then, the scraping stopped directly behind the door. The humming continued, and it was joined by a new sound, a series of loud, wet, sniffing noises coming from the base of the door. Whatever was in there was smelling the pizza. It was smelling me. Then, another sound cut through the humming. A human voice. It was a man, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper. "Easy," he whispered, his voice strained with effort. "Easy. Now, you have to wait. You know the rules." A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway washed over me. The customer was in there, but he wasn't the one who was hungry. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was a terrifying silence. Then, the scraping started again, but it was different this time. It was frantic. It was the sound of claw stick, heavy claw screeching against the inside of the steel door. Scree, scrape, scree. The sound was deafening in the narrow hall. The guttural humming returned, but now it was a series of choked, furious growls. The entire door began to vibrate from the force of whatever was throwing itself against it from the other side. I said, "Wait." The man inside screamed, his voice cracking with panic. I heard a loud crash of breaking glass, followed by a wet, sickening roar that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't animal, it was deeper, more resonant, filled with a kind of ancient, hollow hunger. It was a sound that should not exist in a 9th-floor apartment. That's what finally broke my paralysis. I didn't bother with the elevator. I sprinted for the emergency stairwell. The sound of the man's terrified shouts and that monstrous, inhuman roaring chasing me the entire way down. I burst out into the lobby, and I didn't stop running until I was in my car. Peeling out of the parking lot, I never told anyone at work what really happened. I just said the customer wasn't home. They blacklisted the address after a few more failed delivery attempts from other drivers. I don't know what that man was keeping locked inside apartment 9B, but I know that pizza wasn't a meal for him. It was an offering. It was a desperate attempt to appease a hunger that lived behind a steel door, and I had been the one chosen to deliver the sacrifice. Sometimes, I still hear that roaring in my nightmares, and I know I wasn't just delivering a pizza that night. I was feeding a monster. The night I heard the whispers begin, I was the only soul left in the massive silent warehouse. It was after midnight, just me and the endless rows of forgotten inventory, bathed in the sickly green glow of emergency lights. But it wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something else moving. Something that shouldn't have been there, hidden amongst the shadows. My name is Marc, and I'd been working the overnight shift at the old Bayside logistics facility for nearly 5 years. It was a sprawling, concrete labyrinth built on what used to be marshland, just outside of Chesapeake, Virginia. Most of the time, it was mind-numbingly boring, especially after everyone else clocked out. I'd spend my hours checking security feeds, logging deliveries, and occasionally doing a walkthrough of the main storage bays. The building itself had a certain aged, melancholy, peeling paint, drafty corridors, and an HVAC system that constantly groaned like a dying beast. It was the kind of place you didn't think much about during the day, but at night, its vast emptiness felt heavy, almost oppressive. I'd always considered myself a pretty rational guy, not easily spooked. I'd heard the old-timers tell stories about strange noises or equipment acting up, but I'd always chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too much coffee and too little sleep. My routine was my anchor, a predictable rhythm in the quiet dark, and for the most part, it kept the creeping thoughts at bay. The first oddity was subtle, almost ignoble. A pallet jack I'd left secured in Bay 7 was found in Bay for the next morning, its battery dead. I figured I'd forgotten to secure it, or maybe a prank from the day shift, though it wasn't their style. Then came the whispers. It started during my patrol, a soft, indistinct murmuring that seemed to drift from the upper shelves in Bay 12, an area rarely accessed, piled high with discontinued electronics. I stopped, strained my ears. Nothing, just the hum of the distant fluorescent lights and the creak of the old building settling. I dismissed it as air currents or my mind playing tricks. The following nights, however, the whispers grew clearer, more defined, though still too faint to make out actual words. They sounded like several voices, hushed and urgent, always just out of reach. I started taking my rounds with a flashlight, sweeping it across the darkened aisles, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. Each time, the sound would cut off abruptly as I approached, only to resume once I moved on. One evening, I was in the security office, watching the feed from camera 6, which covered the main loading dock. For a split second, I saw a shadow flicker across the screen, impossibly tall and thin, moving with a speed that defied logic. I rewound the footage, frame by frame, but it was gone. Just a glitch, I told myself, a trick of the light or the old camera system. But a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. The feeling of being watched became constant, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I started leaving the main lights on in sections of the warehouse I wasn't currently in, a futile attempt to push back the encroaching darkness. One night, I was checking the temperature in the refrigerated storage unit, the massive door clanking shut behind me. The air was frigid, mist curling from my breath. As I turned to leave, I heard a sharp, distinct breath drawn in right behind me, so close I could feel a phantom chill on my ear. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the misty air, but there was nothing, only the shelves of frozen goods, silent and still. My heart hammered against my ribs. I practically fumbled with the heavy latch, desperate to get out. The climax arrived on a particularly stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the corrugated iron roof, and the power flickered intermittently. I was in Bay 9, logging some new inventory, when the lights went out completely, plunging the entire warehouse into a suffocating darkness. Only the feeble emergency lights kicked in, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted everything. That's when I heard it, loud and clear, right beside me. Not whispers this time, but a raspy guttural voice that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete floor. It was speaking my name. Mark. ... double quotes. It rasped, drawn out and chillingly intimate. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The air around me grew impossibly cold, and I could smell something foul, like damp earth and decay. My flashlight, clutched in my trembling hand, illuminated nothing but the empty space in front of me. Then, a distinct thump directly behind me, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor, moving closer. I didn't dare turn around. I just ran, blindly crashing through the aisles, the rasping sound of my name and the dragging noise echoing through the darkness, chasing me. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. I never went back to Bayside Logistics. My supervisor called, concerned, but I couldn't explain what had happened. Not really. How do you describe a voice that calls your name in the dark? A dragging sound that follows you through an empty warehouse, and the feeling of something ancient and malevolent breathing down your neck. Now, even in my own apartment, when the house settles at night, I sometimes hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the air, just beyond the edge of hearing, calling my name. The last call I answered that night was the one that wasn't for me. A high-pitched, childish giggle echoing through the empty call center. I was the sole night operator, surrounded by rows of silent cubicles and the blinking red lights of abandoned phones. And that giggle was the first crack in the carefully constructed normalcy of my solitary shift. My name is Sarah, and for the past 2 years, my world had revolved around the graveyard shift at Connect Solutions, a 24/7 customer service center situated in a bland, 2-story building in a quiet business park outside of Phoenix, Arizona. Most nights were a blur of minor technical support issues, billing inquiries, and the occasional disgruntled customer. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., it was just me. The building itself was generic, beige walls, worn carpet, and the ever-present hum of the server room. During the day, it bustled with hundreds of agents, but by night, it transformed into a cavernous, echoing shell. I liked the solitude, for the most part. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to my chaotic home life. I'd bring my books, my noise-canceling headphones, and settle into the quiet rhythm of the night. The only sounds were my own typing, the occasional ping of a new incoming call, and the distant, almost comforting drone of the AC unit. I considered myself pragmatic, not one for ghost stories or superstitions. This was just a job, a way to pay the bills. And the stillness of the deserted office was a bonus, not a source of dread. The odd occurrences started subtly. One night, I found a child's drawing, crayon bright, and depicting stick figures holding hands, taped to my monitor. I assumed it was a forgotten item from one of the day shift parents, who sometimes brought their kids in for a few hours after school. I took it down, filed it away in the lost and found. A few nights later, a specific chair in the cubicle across from mine, which I always pushed in neatly, would be found pulled out, as if someone had just been sitting there. I'd shrug it off, attributing it to the cleaning crew, or maybe even my own absent-mindedness. But then, the noises began. Soft taps on the dividers, the distinct sound of a chair rolling back, a faint clearing of a throat from an empty cubicle. They were always just at the periphery of my hearing, easily dismissed as the building settling or the wind outside. However, the giggles were different. They started as mere whispers, like children playing very, very far away. I'd pull off my headphones, listen intently, but they would vanish. Then, during a particularly slow night, a call came in on line 3. It flashed red, indicating a new customer. I answered with my usual, "Thank you for calling Connect Solutions. My name is Sarah. How may I help you?" All I heard was the distinct, innocent sound of a child giggling, followed by the click of the line disconnecting. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank call. There was an unsettling purity to the sound. I checked the call logs, but there was no record of the incoming number. Over the next few weeks, the giggles became more frequent, always on disconnected lines, always just out of reach. I began to feel a presence, like unseen eyes watching me from the shadows between the cubicles. The air in the office often felt heavy, despite the AC, and a faint, sweet smell, like old candy, would sometimes drift through the air, only to disappear as quickly as it came. I started leaving the lights on in other sections of the office, finding the all-encompassing darkness too oppressive. I'd sometimes catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of white, a tiny shadow darting behind a desk, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. My sleep suffered. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly listening. The building, once a haven of peace, now felt like a cage, and I, the only occupant, was being hunted by something playful and terribly old. One stormy night, the power flickered violently, plunging the entire call center into momentary darkness before the emergency lights hummed to life. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I was the only one in the entire vast space. Suddenly, all the phones on the main switchboard lit up simultaneously, a horrifying cacophony of ringing. I stared, paralyzed, as every single red light pulsed, demanding attention. Then, from the very back of the call center, where the training rooms were, I heard it. A small, clear voice, singing a nursery rhyme. It was faint at first, then grew louder, closer, echoing unnaturally through the empty space. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of pasi es ... double quotes. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was no child in the building. Yet the voice continued, drawing nearer, the nursery rhyme chillingly distorted by the echoes. I saw a small, flickering shadow, barely visible in the emergency light, move from behind a row of cubicles, then another, then another. They were indistinct, tiny, like distorted outlines of children. The air dropped to an icy temperature, and the sweet, sickly smell of old candy filled my nostrils, overpowering everything else. The singing grew louder, the giggles joining in, a chorus of innocent voices that felt utterly malicious. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. A small, cold hand, impossibly small and frail, brushed against my arm. I screamed. I don't remember much after that, just a blur of adrenaline and sheer terror. I sprinted out of the office, leaving my bag, my phone, everything behind. I didn't even bother to lock up. I just ran, never looking back, until I was safely in my car and miles away. I quit the next day, of course, giving some vague excuse about a family emergency. They understood, but the look in my supervisor's eyes, the knowing pity, told me they'd probably heard similar stories before. Even now, months later, when I'm alone and the silence stretches too long, I sometimes hear it, a faint, distant giggle, or the echo of a child's song. And sometimes, a sweet, cloying scent will waft through my apartment. A chilling reminder of the night I was truly alone, at work. The deeper I went into the mine, the more the air itself seemed to press in, thick with dust and an ancient, unsettling silence. Then, a single, deliberate tap echoed through the darkness, far deeper than I'd ever ventured, a sound that shouldn't have been there, because I was the only living thing for miles. My name is David, and for the past year, I'd been working as a night watchman for the old Blackwood mine, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It had been shut down for decades, deemed too dangerous and unprofitable. But a small crew was still tasked with monitoring for structural integrity and preventing copper theft from the abandoned sections. My shift started at sunset and ended with the first hint of dawn, a lonely vigil over collapsing timbers and forgotten shafts. The main office was a small, dusty shack at the entrance, connected to an elaborate system of pressure sensors and motion detectors placed throughout the accessible parts of the mine. The mine itself was a vast, cold maw, tunnels stretching for miles underground, some flooded, some choked with rock. The air was always heavy with the smell of damp earth and stale minerals. I was a man who preferred his own company, and the isolation of the mountains suited me. I'd grown up in a small town nearby, so I knew the local legends of the mountain folk and strange disappearances. But I always dismissed them as old wives' tales, products of too much moonshine and vivid imaginations. My job was simple: monitor the sensors, make a perimeter check, and occasionally venture into the upper sections to replace a faulty detector. The first hint that something was amiss came not from a sensor, but from the faint scent of woods. One particularly cold night, as I was making my rounds near the main entrance, a faint aroma of burning wood drifted on the frigid air. It wasn't the smell of my own small fire in the watchman's shack, but something wilder, deeper. I searched the immediate area, thinking perhaps some hikers had made a rogue campfire, but found nothing. The scent vanished as quickly as it had appeared. A few nights later, the motion sensor for Section C, an old, partially flooded tunnel leading to a deeper, collapsed shaft, kept triggering intermittently. Each time I checked the feed, there was nothing, just the murky water and ancient rock. I'd reset it, attributing it to a loose wire or perhaps a rat, but the triggers became more frequent, always in Section C, always for only a second or two. Then, the sounds began. Soft, almost imperceptible scratching noises, like fingernails dragging across rock, coming from the ventilation shafts that snaked throughout the mine. I'd rap on the metal, hoping to scare away whatever critter was making the racket, but the scratching would only stop for a moment before resuming, often from a different part of the mine. One night, I was down in a more stable upper section, replacing a sensor, when my lamp flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, I distinctly heard what sounded like a series of low, rhythmic thumps, like something heavy being dragged, coming from a side tunnel that was supposedly completely collapsed and impassable. I froze, my heart pounding, waiting for my lamp to come back on. When it did, the sound was gone. I spent the rest of that night with a knot in my stomach. The legends of the mountain folk, of things that lived deep within the earth, began to creep into my thoughts. I started carrying an old, heavy pickaxe with me on my rounds, more for psychological comfort than actual defense. The feeling of being watched intensified, a chill that had nothing to do with the mine's temperature. I'd often find myself staring into the vast, lightless openings of deeper tunnels, feeling an inexplicable pull, a dark curiosity that both terrified and fascinated me. The escalating dread reached its terrifying peak during a deep maintenance run. The main pressure sensor in the lowest accessible shaft, Shaft 17, had gone completely dark, a critical failure. This shaft was usually off limits due to instability, but protocol dictated it had to be checked. Armed with a heavy-duty lamp, my pickaxe, and a palpable sense of unease, I descended into the suffocating darkness. The deeper I went, the more the air grew thick and heavy, and an oppressive silence pressed in, broken only by the drip of unseen water and my own ragged breathing. I reached the sensor's location, a narrow passage barely wide enough to walk through. The air here was strangely still, devoid of any natural currents. As I knelt to examine the faulty unit, my lamp beam danced over the rough-hewn rock walls, revealing nothing but ancient strata. Suddenly, a low guttural growl vibrated through the rock itself, seemingly emanating from the wall directly beside me. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something ancient, primal, filled with an unfathomable rage. My blood ran cold. The growl intensified, and then, a series of heavy, deliberate taps echoed from deeper within the rock, as if something massive was striking the tunnel wall, testing its limits. My lamp began to flicker erratically, plunging the shaft into momentary darkness with each terrifying growl and tap. I could smell something rank, like decaying flesh and damp earth, filling the air. Then, from the very end of the narrow passage, where my light couldn't quite reach, 2 pinpricks of dull yellow light appeared, gleaming with malevolent intelligence. They were eyes, and they were staring directly at me. A low, raspy whisper slithered out from the darkness, a language I didn't understand, but its intent was crystal clear. "You are not welcome here." The eyes began to move, slowly, deliberately, closer. I scrambled back, dropping my tools, the pickaxe clattering uselessly on the rock floor. I didn't look back, just scrabbled, clawed, and stumbled my way out of that suffocating tunnel. The growl and the rhythmic tapping echoing behind me, chasing me up the shaft. I burst out of the mine entrance into the cold night air, gasping, shaking, completely disoriented. I quit that very morning, leaving my keys and a terse resignation note on the watchman's desk. I never looked back at Blackwood Mine. Now, even back in civilization, the deep, primeval silence of the mountains seems to follow me. Sometimes, when the night is particularly still, I can still hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Deep within the earth, a sound meant only for things that live in the dark. The snow fell without ceasing that winter, burying everything in a suffocating blanket of white. But it was the silence that truly got to me, a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped, leaving only me and the faint, almost melodic scratching that began on my cabin door, always just after midnight. My name is Elias, and I'd sought refuge from the world in a remote cabin tucked deep within the Teton Range in Wyoming. It was an isolated, hand-built structure, miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by snowmobile in the harsher months. I was a recluse by nature, an artist seeking solitude and inspiration in the raw, untamed wilderness. This particular winter had been brutal, a relentless assault of blizzards that piled snowdrifts higher than my windows. The cabin was cozy enough, with a wood-burning stove and a generator for electricity, but its isolation was absolute. My nearest neighbor was a good 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another human face in weeks. I'd always found peace in the stark beauty of winter, the way it stripped the world bare. The creak of old timber, the hiss of the fire, the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of snow, these were my companions. I considered myself self-sufficient, grounded, not prone to flights of fancy. The wilderness was harsh, yes, but it was predictable, governed by natural laws. The first anomaly was a subtle disruption of the pristine snowscape. I'd wake up some mornings to find a single, distinct set of footprints leading from the edge of the tree line directly to my cabin door, stopping abruptly as if the person had simply vanished. There were no return prints. I rationalized it as an animal, perhaps a large wolf or a mountain lion, though the prints were disturbingly humanoid in their general shape. Then, my supplies started to dwindle faster than they should have. A sack of flour, a tin of coffee, small items, easily overlooked. I blamed my own forgetfulness, or perhaps a leaky storage container. But then came the scratching. It started as a faint, almost delicate sound, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap on the thick wooden planks of my cabin door. Always in the dead of night, I'd grab my rifle, heart pounding, and cautiously approach, peering through the small peephole, but there was never anything there. Just the swirling snow and the skeletal trees, silent witnesses to an unseen presence. The scratching would stop as soon as I moved, only to resume once I was back in bed. A little louder each time, a little more insistent. I started sleeping with my rifle propped against the wall beside my bed. One morning, I found a small, intricately carved wooden figurine on my doorstep, resembling a twisted, elongated human figure with hollow eyes. It wasn't mine, and I had no idea where it could have come from. I tossed it into the fire, trying to shake off the growing dread, but the image of those hollow eyes lingered. The cabin, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a trap. The boundless wilderness outside, once a source of comfort, now felt like a vast, empty expanse hiding something ancient and malevolent. The rising action was a slow, agonizing descent into paranoia. The footprints became more frequent, sometimes appearing overnight, encircling my cabin multiple times, always leading to the door and then vanishing. The scratching evolved into a low, mournful scraping sound, like claws dragging across the wood, punctuated by soft, almost human sighs that seemed to carry on the wind. My generator, normally reliable, began to sputter and die at random intervals, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, leaving me alone with the growing sounds outside. I'd find myself staring out the window for hours, convinced I saw movement in the swirling snow, a gaunt, shadowy figure flitting between the trees. My food continued to disappear, not just small items now, but entire cans of stew, bags of dried fruit. I tried to secure my cabin, barricading the windows with spare timber, reinforcing the door. It felt futile. One night, a blizzard raged with unprecedented fury. The wind howled like a tormented banshee, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. The scratching on the door was no longer discreet. It was a frantic, desperate clawing, accompanied by ragged breathing that was clearly audible through the thick wood. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I could hear something sniffing, wet and deliberate, right on the other side. Then, a voice. It was a low, raspy whisper, like dry leaves skittering across ice, just barely forming words. "Let me in," it wheezed, drawn out and guttural. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far colder. I retreated, trembling, back to my rifle, huddling by the dwindling fire, listening to the relentless assault on my door, the thing outside trying to breach my sanctuary. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. I was deep in the wilderness, miles from anywhere, and something was trying to get in. The sound of splintering would rip through the night. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, triumphant groan. My cabin door, reinforced as it was, had given way, a jagged crack running from the top panel down to the lock, a shard of ice-cold air, smelling faintly of pine needles, and something foul blasted into the cabin. I stared, paralyzed, at the widening fissure in the door. Through the gap, in the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, I saw it. Two eyes, glowing with a cold, pale light, like distant stars. They were set in a gaunt, skeletal face, elongated and almost canine, framed by matted, snow-dusted hair. Its body was impossibly thin, gaunt, wrapped in what looked like tattered frost-covered furs. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, forcing the door open, inch by agonizing inch. A long, bony, finger-like appendage, reaching through the gap, extending towards me. Its lips, cracked and blue, slowly parted, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Hungry, ... double quotes. It rasped, a sound that would forever haunt my nightmares, as the glowing eyes fixed on mine. I didn't wait. With a primal scream, I shouldered my rifle and fired. The blast ripped through the cabin, echoing in the confined space. I saw a shower of splinters, a guttural shriek that was swallowed by the wind, and then the figure recoiled, vanishing back into the blizzard. I reloaded, shaking, and slammed the door shut, dragging my heavy workbench against it, piling anything I could find to reinforce it. I spent the rest of that night huddled by the fire, listening to the wind, terrified it would return. By dawn, I was a broken man. I packed only the essentials, abandoning my art, my solitude, everything. The snowmobile ride out was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I never looked back at that cabin, never returned to the mountains. Even now, in the warmth of a city apartment, the sound of wind against the windows or the soft tap-tap-tap of rain can send me into a cold sweat. I know what lives in the deep woods of winter, and it remembers me. The snowstorm hit without warning, turning the winding mountain road into a whiteout death trap. My truck skidded, then plunged into a deep ditch, leaving me stranded in the heart of the White Mountains, New Hampshire, miles from anywhere, with nothing but the rapidly dropping temperature and the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. My name is Kevin, and I was on my way back from a remote logging site, an isolated stretch of forest near Lincoln, where I'd been inspecting equipment. It was late November, the kind of time when you expect a chill, but not a full-blown blizzard. I prided myself on my wilderness survival skills, having spent most of my life working and hiking in these very mountains. My Ford F-250 was my mobile office, and often my temporary home, equipped with emergency supplies, a robust CB radio, and enough gear to brave most conditions. This part of New Hampshire was known for its sudden weather shifts and its old, forgotten logging trails that often led to nowhere. The forest was dense, ancient, and during the winter, it held a profound, almost spiritual stillness. I respected the wild, knew its dangers, but I'd never truly feared it. I was a practical man, a problem solver, and getting stranded was just another problem to be solved. The immediate aftermath of the crash was a blur of adrenaline and muffled impacts. Once the truck settled, half buried in a snowdrift, I tried the CB radio. Static. My cell phone had no signal. I was truly cut off. I decided to hunker down, conserve fuel, and wait for daylight. The wind howled outside, a relentless, mournful cry that shook the truck. As the hours crawled by, the snow continued to fall, burying my truck deeper, turning the landscape into an undifferentiated sea of white. That's when the first peculiar thing happened. I noticed a faint light, a soft, pulsating glow, deep within the forest, about a quarter mile from the road. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the flicker of a fire. It was more organic, like a faint bioluminescence. I dismissed it as an illusion, perhaps reflections from ice crystals or a trick of my tired eyes. But the light persisted, pulsing rhythmically, drawing my gaze. Later, as I tried to doze, I heard a sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard in the woods. It wasn't an animal, nor the wind. It was a low, resonant hum, like a gigantic, distant bell, vibrating through the very ground. It seemed to come from the direction of the pulsing light. I grabbed my hunting rifle, a sense of unease creeping in. I knew these woods, and nothing I knew made that sound. The rising action was a chilling symphony of the unknown. The pulsing light remained, sometimes moving, sometimes stationary, always just out of reach, always just visible through the dense snowfall. The hum became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by a low, guttural chittering sound, like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together, but on a massive scale. My truck's battery, fully charged before the storm, began to drain rapidly, inexplicably. I tried to start the engine, to run the heater, but it barely sputtered. I was losing my last link to warmth and communication. I began to venture short distances from the truck, desperate to find higher ground for a cell signal or perhaps a sign of another road. But the snow was too deep, the visibility too poor. Each time, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision, impossibly tall, thin shapes weaving between the snow-laden trees. They were never fully formed, always disappearing as soon as I turned my head. One night, I saw the pulsing light much closer, almost at the edge of the tree line beside the road, perhaps 50 yards away. It was a pale, bluish glow, and within it, I could make out a vague, amorphous form, constantly shifting and flowing, like mist, given solidity. The hum was louder now, a physical pressure in my chest, and the chittering filled the air, seeming to come from all directions. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a bear, or a wolf, or any animal I knew. This was something utterly alien. I retreated into the truck, pulling my sleeping bag tighter, my rifle clutched in my hands, trying to convince myself it was hypothermia playing tricks on my mind. But the cold was real, The isolation was real, and the fear was terrifyingly real. My food supplies, carefully rationed, started to disappear. Not just small items, but entire MREs. As if someone, or something, was carefully plucking them from my emergency kit. The climax arrived on the third night. The storm had finally begun to abate, leaving behind an otherworldly calm. I was huddled in the cab, shivering, when the pulsing blue light appeared directly outside my driver's side window. It was so close, I could feel a strange, electric tingle on my skin. The hum was deafening, a low thrumming that resonated deep within my bones. Within the light, a shape slowly began to resolve itself. It was immense, impossibly tall, a gaunt, elongated figure, shrouded in shadow, with long, slender limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. It had no discernible face, only two glowing ice-blue orbs, where eyes should be, fixated on me. Then, it pressed one of its unnaturally long, multi-jointed fingers against my window. The glass frosted over instantly, and a faint, high-pitched whine filled the cab, like a tortured violin string. The creature began to emit a low, guttural moan, a sound of profound hunger and ancient sorrow, and the chittering intensified, coming from just outside the truck, all around me. It was trying to communicate, I realized with sickening dread, or perhaps it was simply acknowledging its prey. I didn't think. I kicked open the passenger door, scrambling out into the waist-deep snow, my rifle forgotten. I ran, blindly, through the pristine white landscape, towards the distant, barely visible outline of the main road, the piercing hum and the cold, unblinking blue eyes burning into my mind. I don't know how long I ran, or how I survived the exposure. Eventually, hypothermia began to set in, and I collapsed, losing consciousness. I woke up in a hospital bed, frostbitten, but alive, found by a snowplow crew. I never told them what I saw. How could I? They'd think I was mad. I never went back to the White Mountains, not even for my truck. Now, whenever the winter winds blow, and the silence of the snow falls too heavily, I see those glowing blue eyes in the dark, and I hear that low, alien hum, a chilling reminder that some things in the wilderness are best left undisturbed. The lake froze solid that winter, a vast, flat expanse of white stretching to the horizon. But it wasn't the silence of the ice that haunted me. It was the faint, rhythmic scraping that began to drift up from beneath it, always just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. My name is Clara, and I'd inherited my grandmother's old cabin on Lake Placid, New York, a quaint, rustic place that had been in my family for generations. I was a city girl by upbringing, but the peace and quiet of the snow-covered lakefront offered a much-needed escape from the relentless pace of urban life. This was my first full winter, living alone at the cabin, and I'd embraced the solitude, the pristine beauty of the frozen landscape. The cabin itself was old, with creaky floorboards and a stone fireplace that was my main source of warmth. It sat right on the edge of the lake, offering an unobstructed view of the vast, snow-covered ice. I spent my days reading, sketching, and walking the cleared path to the tiny general store a mile down the road. I was practical, analytical, not one to believe in ghosts or old legends, though I'd heard whispers from the locals about strange disappearances on the lake in winters past. I attributed it to the treacherous ice and the unforgiving cold. The first oddity was subtle, easily dismissed. I'd notice unusual patterns in the snow on the lake, not the tracks of deer or coyotes, but long, perfectly straight lines, as if something massive had been dragged across the surface for hundreds of yards. I thought perhaps snowmobiles from distant cabins, though I hadn't heard any. Then came the vibrations. As I sat by the fire late one evening, a low, resonant thrum began to emanate from beneath the cabin floor, which was built directly on the rocky shore of the lake. It was too faint to be an earthquake, too rhythmic to be the house settling. It felt like something large was moving, slowly, beneath the ice. I went out onto the porch, straining my ears, but only heard the familiar creak of the ice contracting in the cold. I rationalized it as underground currents or geological activity, but the vibrations became more frequent, always after dusk, always accompanied by a faint, almost melodic scraping sound, like stone against stone, coming from the center of the frozen lake. One evening, I peered out my window with binoculars. In the fading light, I thought I saw a dark, raised mound of ice in the very center of the lake, something that definitely hadn't been there the day before. It was gone by morning, leaving only the endless, flat white. A chilling unease began to settle over me. The scraping sounds intensified, becoming distinctly mechanical, a rhythmic scrape that seemed to emanate directly from beneath my cabin, echoing through the floorboards. The vibrations grew stronger, rattling the dishes in my cupboards, making the water in my glass ripple. It felt like something immense was alive under the ice, slowly, painstakingly, carving its way towards the shore. I started avoiding walking on the lake, even the cleared paths. One afternoon, while I was sketching by the window, I saw it clearly this time, a dark shape, massive and elongated, slowly rising just beneath the surface of the ice, far out in the middle of the lake. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, a colossal shadow playing beneath the frozen surface, leaving behind faint, almost imperceptible grooves in the ice as it passed. It was too large to be any known fish, too purposeful to be a trick of light. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was what was causing the sounds, the vibrations, the strange markings. The mound of ice reappeared, this time closer to my shore, a jagged, unnatural protrusion that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light in the twilight. It was getting closer, steadily, relentlessly. I tried to call a local sheriff, but the phone lines were down, taken out by a recent ice storm. I felt utterly alone, isolated by the vast, frozen lake and the impenetrable wilderness. My sleep was tormented by nightmares of being dragged down into the icy depths of dark shapes moving beneath me. The cabin, once a haven, became a vulnerable shell, besieged by an unseen, unheard force. The lake, once a symbol of peace, became a terrifying, silent threat. The climax arrived on a night of absolute, suffocating silence. The snow had stopped, the wind had died, and the air was utterly still, amplifying every single sound. The rhythmic scraping was no longer distant. It was directly beneath my cabin, a deafening scrape that shook the entire structure, sending shivers through my very bones. The floorboards groaned, splintering under the immense pressure. I grabbed my heaviest flashlight, my hands trembling, and stumbled onto the small, ice-covered dock. The vast expanse of Lake Placid was glowing with an eerie, phosphorescent blue light emanating from directly beneath the ice. In the center of the lake, a colossal, obsidian black form, smooth and unnaturally geometric, was slowly, deliberately rising, pushing up against the thick ice. It was immense, like a vast, sunken ship, but its shape was utterly alien. As it continued to rise, the ice around it groaned and cracked with thunderous roars, splintering into massive shards that shot into the air. And then, I saw the aperture, a single, perfectly circular opening, rimmed with the same pale blue light, slowly began to open on its side, revealing an abyssal darkness within. From that opening, a low, mournful, almost electronic hum resonated, a sound of profound loneliness and ancient power, echoing across the frozen lake, seeming to beckon me. I dropped my flashlight, the beam rolling wildly across the dock. I didn't wait for it to fully emerge, didn't wait to see what might come out of that impossible aperture. I ran, blindly, through the deep snow, away from the glowing lake, away from the rising leviathan, away from the terrifying, beckoning hum. I didn't stop until I reached a general store, collapsing on their porch, incoherent with terror. I never returned to the cabin, never looked back at Lake Placid. They found the cabin a few weeks later, covered in ice, the docks splintered, but the lake was frozen solid, flat and pristine, as if nothing had ever disturbed its surface. Yet, even now, when the winter air gets cold and still, I sometimes hear it, a faint, rhythmic scraping and a low, resonant hum, drifting up from the silence, reminding me of what lies beneath the ice. It started with a simple Craigslist ad, free antique rocking chair, pickup only. What followed wasn't a bargain, but a chilling descent into something far more sinister than I could have imagined, leaving me with a chair that whispers and a lingering dread that still hasn't left me. My name is Emily, and I was a young antique enthusiast living in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. I spent most of my free time browsing online classifieds, always on the hunt for unique, forgotten pieces that I could restore and give new life. Craigslist was a goldmine for such finds, often leading me to quirky characters and interesting stories. I was pragmatic, a bit of a skeptic when it came to anything paranormal, preferring to believe in the tangible history embedded in old objects. This particular ad caught my eye. Beautiful, intricately carved Victorian-era rocking chair, listed for free. The photo was a bit grainy, but the details were stunning. The address listed was in an older, more secluded part of town, nestled amongst dense, overgrown foliage, the kind of place where houses seemed to recede into themselves. I was excited, seeing it as a perfect project, a charming addition to my growing collection. My life was pretty ordinary, filled with work, friends, and the occasional antique hunt. I never expected that a simple online transaction could unravel the fabric of my reality. The first hint of something wrong was the house itself. It was a sprawling, dilapidated Victorian, shrouded in shadows even in the afternoon sun, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. A handwritten sign, barely visible, said back door. I knocked, my knuckles echoing on the rotting wood. After a long silence, the door creaked open just enough for a sliver of darkness to show, and a raspy voice, thin and reedy, whispered, "It's in the parlor. Just take it." No face, just the voice. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of dust and decay, the air thick with the smell of old wood and something vaguely sweet, almost floral, but cloying. The rocking chair sat in the center of a dim parlor, perfectly preserved despite the surrounding desolation. It was even more beautiful up close, with dark, polished wood and velvet upholstery, but it exuded an almost palpable coldness, even in the stuffy room. As I wrestled it out the door, I felt a strange vibration pass through my hands, like a faint, internal hum. I dismissed it as the adrenaline of the unsettling encounter. Back in my apartment, after a thorough cleaning, the rocking chair looked magnificent. But then the whispers started, faint, indistinct murmurs, like dry leaves skittering across a window pane, always coming from the chair when I was alone in the room. I'd approach it, convinced I was hearing things, but the moment I got close, the sounds would vanish. I blamed the old building settling, or perhaps the wind outside, playing tricks on my ears. My cat, Mittens, usually a fearless explorer, refused to go near the chair, her fur bristling, her eyes wide with fear whenever I tried to place her on it. She'd hiss and dart away, disappearing under the bed, something she never did. The rising action was a slow, insidious invasion of my peace. The whispers from the chair became clearer, more insistent. They sounded like several voices, hushed and urgent, weaving in and out of each other, though still too indistinct to make out actual words. It was like listening to a crowded room from behind a thick wall. I tried covering the chair with a sheet, but the whispers seemed to penetrate the fabric, a constant, low drone that frayed my nerves. I started having vivid, disturbing dreams whenever I fell asleep in the same room as the chair. Dreams of a dimly lit parlor, of shadowy figures moving around me, their faces obscured, their hushed voices filling the air with an unsettling warmth. I'd wake up drenched in a cold sweat, the memory of the whispers echoing in my ears. One morning, I found a small, antique silver locket resting on the chair's velvet cushion. It wasn't mine, and it certainly hadn't been there the night before. Inside, there was a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with piercing, sorrowful eyes. I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from it. I tried to research the chair, hoping to find its history, perhaps a connection to the locket. All I found were old, local newspaper clippings about the Victorian house where I'd picked it up, a history riddled with tragedy, mysterious deaths, and a pervasive, lingering grief that seemed to cling to the property. The whispers grew louder still, sometimes sounding like a child crying, sometimes like an old woman humming a mournful tune. I would leave the room, only to return and find the chair gently rocking, slowly, steadily, as if someone had just left it. No open windows, no drafts, just the slow, rhythmic creak of the empty chair. I started barricading my bedroom door at night, pushing a dresser against it, desperate to keep whatever inhabited the chair from reaching me. My sanity felt like it was hanging by a thread, stretched taut by the relentless, unseen presence. The climax arrived on a particularly cold, stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling my apartment windows, and the rain lashed against the glass. I was huddled in my bed, trying to block out the now unmistakable sound of someone gently rocking in the chair in my living room. The rhythmic creak a terrifying counterpoint to the storm. The whispers were no longer indistinct. They were clear, chillingly so. I heard a chorus of voices, male and female, old and young, all speaking at once. Their words overlapping, indistinct yet filled with a palpable anguish. Then, one voice rose above the others, a child's voice, sweet and clear, singing a lullaby. My heart hammered against my ribs. The rocking slowed, then stopped. A profound silence fell over the apartment, more terrifying than the noise. Then, a single, deliberate thump from the living room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across my hardwood floor, heading directly towards my bedroom door. The dresser I had pushed against the door began to scrape, slowly, against the wood, as if something was pushing against it from the other side, trying to get in. I screamed, a raw, primal sound ripped from my throat. I sprang from my bed, fumbling for my phone, desperate to call anyone, anything. The dresser continued to scrape, the wood groaning under an unseen force. I didn't wait to see what was pushing it. I threw on the first clothes I could find, grabbed my car keys, and bolted out of my apartment, leaving the door wide open, the rocking chair and its terrifying inhabitants behind. I never went back to that apartment, never even bothered to retrieve my belongings. I moved to a different city, started over. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and the house settles, I can still hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the air, and the gentle, rhythmic creak of an empty rocking chair, forever haunting the edges of my hearing. Overnight security guard needed, remote location. I figured it would be an easy gig. Just me and the quiet of the old abandoned mall. I was wrong. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, and the messages that started coming through on the mall's ancient intercom system weren't for me. My name is Jake, and I was a college student in Houston, Texas, looking for some easy money to cover tuition. Craigslist always had plenty of odd jobs, and this one, a security guard position at the defunct Northwood Galleria, seemed perfect. The mall had been a booming retail hub in the 80s and 90s, but it had slowly died out, finally closing its doors 5 years ago. Now, it was a skeletal monument to consumerism, scheduled for demolition next year. My job was to patrol, ensure no vandals or squatters, and generally keep an eye on the place from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The building was vast, a labyrinth of darkened storefronts, echoing food courts, and miles of silent hallways. It smelled of stale popcorn, dust, and decay. I'd always considered myself pretty level-headed, not easily spooked. The idea of ghosts or hauntings was for movies, not real life. This was just a job, a temporary gig, a way to make a buck. My only companion was a trusty flashlight, a walkie-talkie connected to a defunct main office, and the endless silence of the abandoned space. The first hint of something wrong was the temperature. Despite it being a mild autumn night, certain sections of the mall were inexplicably frigid, particularly around the old toy store and the children's clothing boutiques. I'd feel a sudden drop in temperature, a cold spot that made the hairs on my arms stand up, only for it to dissipate as quickly as it came. I blamed faulty HVAC systems or drafts. Then, the mannequins started to move, not overtly, but subtly. I'd do my rounds, noting a mannequin in a particular pose in a darkened storefront, only to find it slightly shifted on my next pass, an arm angled differently, a head tilted. I'd chuckle, attributing it to my imagination or perhaps a prank by the previous guard. But then came the voices. Faint, echoing murmurs that seemed to drift from the defunct PA system. They sounded like distant conversations, muffled by time and distance, always just out of reach, always just indistinct enough that I couldn't make out any words. I'd tap the old intercom, assuming a short circuit, but the sounds would cut off, only to resume once I moved on. One night, as I passed the old arcade, I heard the distinct, tinny melody of an 8-bit video game playing from within the darkened, empty space. I peered through the grime-covered glass, shining my flashlight inside, but the machines were all unplugged, covered in sheets. The music stopped. My heart began to pound a little faster. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. The voices on the intercom grew clearer, sometimes sounding like children, laughing and shouting, sometimes like women gossiping, sometimes like the low murmur of a crowd. They would only play for a few seconds before cutting out, always just as I approached the nearest speaker. The mannequins became more overtly restless. I'd find them facing different directions, sometimes in entirely different storefronts than where I'd left them. One night, I found a child-sized mannequin in the middle of the main concourse, its head tilted, staring directly at me with its blank, plastic eyes. I pushed it back to its store, my hands trembling. The cold spots intensified, often accompanied by the distinct, sweet smell of cotton candy or stale popcorn, evoking a phantom memory of the mall's lively past. My walkie-talkie, which had been mostly static, started to pick up strange transmissions. Not voices, but a series of clicks and whistles. An unsettling, almost intelligent pattern that sounded like a conversation in an unknown language. It felt like someone was trying to communicate with me, or perhaps through me. I started to see shadows, long and distorted, moving with impossible speed down the vast empty corridors, always disappearing just as I turned my head. One particularly unsettling evening, I was patrolling the lower level, near the old food court, when I heard it, a frantic, desperate pounding, like someone trapped, coming from inside the darkened movie theater. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but the theater doors were securely chained and locked from the outside. The pounding continued, growing louder, accompanied by what sounded like muffled screams. I yelled out, "Hello, is anyone in there?" The pounding stopped abruptly. A profound silence fell, then a single, clear whisper. "Help, ... double quotes, drifted from beneath the theater doors. The climax arrived on a night of oppressive stillness. The intercom was silent, the walkie-talkie dead, and the mannequins were all in their places, eerily still. I was doing my final round, making my way through the darkened department store, when I heard a distinct thump, ... coming from the center of the vast, empty space. It sounded like a giant, slow heartbeat. I froze, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, searching for the source. The thumping grew louder, vibrating through the linoleum floor. Then, I saw it. In the center of the department store, where a display of high-end clothing once stood. A single, glowing red light pulsed erratically, rising slowly from the floor. As it ascended, the air around it grew impossibly cold, and a low guttural moan filled the vast space. Echoing off the high ceilings, the light pulsed faster, and within its crimson glow, a shape slowly began to form, swirling like smoke given solidity. It was immense, amorphous, constantly shifting, with countless indistinct faces, momentarily appearing within its swirling form, their mouths open in silent screams. The thumping became deafening, and a chorus of whispers, screams, and desperate pleas erupted from all the surrounding storefronts, all at once, as if every ghost in the mall had suddenly awakened. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I dropped my flashlight, turning and sprinting blindly through the labyrinthine corridors. The thumping echoing in my ears, the cacophony of spectral voices chasing me, the red light pulsating in my peripheral vision. I burst out of the mall's main entrance, into the cool night air, gasping, shaking, utterly terrified. I never went back to the Northwood Galleria. I quit that very morning, leaving my keys and uniform in a bewildered manager's mailbox. I still drive past the mall sometimes, its decaying facade a stark reminder of that terrifying winter. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet, empty space, I can still hear it, a faint, distant murmur. The echo of forgotten laughter, and the terrifying, rhythmic thump-thump of a heart that shouldn't beat. The ad was for a vintage camera lens, a rare find, listed by someone in the deep desert outside Las Vegas. What I found wasn't just a lens, but a house that shouldn't exist, and a presence that watched from the shadows, eager to add me to its collection. My name is Marcus, and I was a freelance photographer, always on the lookout for unique equipment to fuel my passion. Craigslist was my go-to for obscure and vintage gear, often leading me on unexpected adventures. I considered myself adventurous, logical, and immune to superstitions. The desert held a certain stark beauty for me, a raw, untamed landscape that was perfect for my artistic pursuits. This particular ad offered a rare, German-made lens from the 1950s at an unbelievably low price. The seller's address was vague, described only as off Highway 160, past Red Rock Canyon. Look for the faded water tower. It was a 2-hour drive from my apartment in Henderson, Nevada, deep into the isolated stretches of the Mojave. I packed my gear, a full tank of gas, and a sense of excitement for the potential find. I had no idea that this simple transaction would lead me to the edge of my sanity. The drive itself was unsettling. The highway eventually gave way to a rough, unpaved road, then little more than a dirt track winding through a desolate, scrub-filled landscape. The faded water tower, when I finally found it, was a skeletal monument to some forgotten dream. The seller's directions then led me down an even narrower path, barely visible, to a small, isolated shack that seemed to have materialized out of the desert itself. It was a ramshackle structure, pieced together from rusted corrugated metal and sun-bleached wood, with a single, unlit window. No car, no other signs of life. I hesitated, a prickle of unease running down my spine. This wasn't just remote. It felt abandoned. I knocked on the flimsy door, my knuckles echoing in the vast silence. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a man who was impossibly thin. His skin like dried leather, his eyes shadowed and unblinking. He didn't speak, just gestured with a skeletal hand towards the inside. The air inside was stifling, thick with dust and an acrid, metallic smell. The lens sat on a makeshift table, surrounded by piles of discarded electronics and ancient, unidentifiable parts. As I picked up the lens, I felt a strange heat emanating from it, a faint vibration that seemed to hum against my fingertips. The man snatched the cash from my hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and then, with a raspy cough, vanished into the shadows of the shack, leaving me alone in the dim light. I quickly exited, the unsettling encounter leaving a sour taste in my mouth. Back in my apartment, the lens worked perfectly, producing stunning, almost hyperreal images. But then, the static began. Faint, distorted radio static, always playing from my camera when it was turned off. A low hiss that seemed to permeate the silence of my apartment. I'd check the camera, remove the battery, but the static would return, a ghost in the machine. Something had followed me home. The static on my camera became more insistent, sometimes accompanied by faint, almost subliminal whispers that seemed to be buried within the hiss. Too indistinct to make out, yet profoundly unsettling. My apartment, usually a haven, began to feel like a surveillance room. I'd come home to find objects subtly rearranged, a book moved from one shelf to another, a coffee mug turned upside down. Small things easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, but they happened with increasing frequency. My cat, a usually playful tabby, became withdrawn, spending her days hiding under the bed, her eyes wide and fixed on unseen points in the room. I started taking test shots with the new lens, pointing my camera at empty rooms, just experimenting. The photos were startling, in the deep shadows, almost imperceptible. Ghostly outlines of elongated figures would sometimes appear, wavering, transparent, their forms indistinct but their presence undeniable. They were always just at the edge of the frame, always partially obscured. My sleep became a fragmented nightmare of being watched, of flickering shadows and disembodied voices. One particularly disturbing night, I woke up to the sound of my camera, sitting on my bedside table, actively recording. The red light was on, pulsing in the darkness. I snatched it up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pointed it around my empty room. The viewfinder showed only darkness, but as I played back the footage, a chilling, guttural sigh whispered from the camera's tiny speaker, followed by a faint, metallic clink that sounded like the lens being twisted. Then, the screen went black. I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that something was in my apartment, and it was using the lens to see, to watch me. The climax arrived during a desperate attempt to understand. I had the lens on my camera, pointed at the darkened corner of my living room, where I'd seen the most fleeting shadows. The static was a constant, deafening roar now, and the whispers were clearer, more defined, a chorus of dry, raspy voices, speaking in ancient, guttural language. The air in my apartment was impossibly heavy, thick with the same metallic, acrid smell I'd encountered at the shack in the desert. My cat was huddled in the farthest corner of the room, whimpering softly. My hands trembled as I peered through the camera's viewfinder. The corner was no longer empty. In the heart of the deepest shadow, a swirling vortex of shimmering heat and light was forming, like a tear in the fabric of reality, and from within that swirling vortex, a long, impossibly thin limb, covered in a mottled, grayish skin, slowly began to emerge, stretching into my living room. It ended in a series of segmented, needle-like digits, twitching and probing the air. Then, two eyes, glowing with a malevolent, pulsing red light, opened within the vortex, fixing themselves on me through the lens. The whispers solidified into a single, resonant voice, ancient and echoing, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It spoke my name. Marcus, you have what is ours. ... I screamed, dropping the camera, the lens shattering on the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The vortex dissipated, the limb retracted, and the red eyes vanished, leaving behind only the sudden, profound silence and the metallic stench. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my cat, and bolted out of my apartment, leaving everything behind. I drove until the sun rose, until the desert was far behind me. I never returned to that apartment, never touched another Craigslist ad again. Even now, in a new city, far from the desert, the faint hiss of static or the metallic temps in the air can send me into a cold sweat. I know what lies in the shadows, what ancient things collect forgotten objects, and what it means to be watched by eyes that are not of this world.